Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. This is Neil at UVM Medical Center. We have Dr. Ben Lee with us today. He's a pediatric infectious disease expert, and he'll be able to speak to you about approval of the Pfizer vaccine for 12 to 15-year-olds. Dr. Marjorie Meyer will be joining us in a little bit. She is not able to be on just yet. So if you have questions for her about vaccination for people who are pregnant, you'll be able to address those a little bit later. I will briefly turn it over to Dr. Lee for now to introduce himself and give a few opening remarks. Dr. Lee.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So as Neil mentioned, my name is Benjamin Lee. I'm a pediatric infectious diseases specialist at the University of Vermont Children's Hospital. And I've been following, obviously, the COVID-19 saga very closely, particularly as it relates to children in Vermont. And so, I think at the end of the day, I'm just thrilled that, in May of 2021, we're already at the point where we have vaccines that will become available to kids as young as 12 years of age. I think it's a stunning achievement. I think the data are very clear that the vaccine is safe and effective, and I can't wait for Vermont's adolescents to start getting vaccinated.
Thanks, Dr. Lee. We have a number of people on today, but we will start with WPTZ. Kristen, you're up first.
Hi there. Hi, Dr. Lee. How are you?
Hello, fine, thanks.
Hi. So are there any health conditions that would prevent a child from 12 to 15 years old from being eligible to get vaccinated?
For being ineligible to get vaccinated?
Yes.
Well, the only contraindications for vaccination, meaning the only reasons why somebody definitely should not get it is if they have a known severe allergy, meaning anaphylaxis, to any of the vaccine components. All of the other, any other potential, history of allergy, even severe allergy due to any other cause is not a contraindication. So those kids can and should receive vaccination. This vaccine, similar to all of the currently EUA authorized COVID-19 vaccines that are available for use in the United States, it's not a live vaccine. So even children who are immunocompromised are eligible to receive the vaccine. The only caution there is that not everybody who receives the vaccine might mount as good of an immune response if they do have an immunocompromising condition, for example.
Okay. The next question I wanted to ask you is, what could this discovery mean when it comes to vaccinating even younger children?
Well, in general, the process for making vaccines available to the youngest children follows the same process. Usually vaccines would be tested in adults first, and then they typically would undergo what's known as an age de-escalation strategy, where then the vaccine gets tested in successfully younger and younger cohorts until you can reach all the way down to infancy. And that is the schedule that the vaccine manufacturers already are on. And so I think this is very encouraging that these vaccines will also prove to be safe and effective in younger children as well. Those studies generally happen after studies in the older age group. So that's why those usually take a little bit longer before they have those results. But I'm very optimistic that these results mean that these vaccines will be available at some point in the future for the youngest kids as well.
So you do foresee that it is a possibility that, in the future, this vaccination could even possibly be approved for kids younger than 12?
Absolutely. In fact, my understanding is Pfizer already believes that they should have enough data by September to file another extension for their emergency use authorization with the FDA for children down to the age of 2. So those trials are in progress, and at least thus far, all indications are that that we should see promising data for the younger kids coming later this summer.
I think some people might be confused when it's said like for emergency use. What does that mean, and why is that kind of thrown in there sometimes?
So this refers to a distinction between an authorization for emergency use versus a formal approval. So typically the formal FDA approval process is a little bit longer, and there's some certain minimum requirements in terms of amount of time the companies have follow-up data for example. So currently all of the vaccines are approved for emergency use, meaning the data indicate clearly that they're safe and they're effective, but they just don't have the ability yet to put through a formal approval. Now, we're now at that stage with the Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer has submitted their vaccine for a full FDA approval, so hopefully that should be coming out soon as well.
So the full FDA approval should be coming out soon, and then kind of that for emergency use can be taken out of there.
Yes, for the specific vaccine that meets the approval, then it would just be approved, and it wouldn't be considered for emergency use only.
Okay, just because I think that without it having the full FDA approval, which I'm happy you addressed, I think that's what's causing maybe some hesitancy. So I'm happy that you talked about that, and you basically are saying that it is approved. It's just getting through that final step okay.
Yeah, I guess the best way that the way that I might view this is it's not a question of whether the vaccines are safe or effective. It's more than anything, it's if anything, more a bureaucratic distinction than any concern about the performance or safety of the vaccines themselves.
Okay, I just had one more question. How have pediatricians been prepared to answer these questions that they might be presented to from concerned parents? And what is the real value that can be found in those one-on-one interactions?
Well, I think there's tremendous value in those one-on-one interactions. Typically, studies have shown over and over again, one of the single best predictors of whether somebody will follow any type of health recommendation is if that recommendation comes from a trusted provider. And so I think there's no substitute for having those close one-on-one discussions between families and a trusted medical provider and pediatricians for their children. Now, Vermont is very unique in that there's a very, very close-knit pediatric community. And there have been, throughout the pandemic, there have been a series of ongoing conversations, calls, discussions with practices from around the state where these topics and this type of information is discussed. One of the avenues for that is this terrific program that's run through the University of Vermont called VCHIP, the Vermont Children's Health Improvement Program, where since the beginning of the pandemic, that's been open to practices that care for children to call in. It's 3 times a week, and this is a network that allows pediatricians to talk directly to one another. So that's that's one example of how pediatricians have been sort of talking and discussing and getting ready for this big push coming up ahead. We have tremendous leadership here within our local American Academy of Pediatrics chapter as well. Rebecca Bell, our Vermont AAP president, has been a terrific advocate and leader in leading this conversation throughout the state as well. So I think you can rest assured that the pediatrics community here has had a keen interest in getting these vaccines, being able to provide these vaccines for our kids. And I can tell you that there's just a tremendous amount of excitement throughout the pediatric community right now because of this development.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Dom at WCAX, you are up.
Great. Thanks, Neil. Hello, doctor. Thank you for doing this. We appreciate it. I am wondering, there's already so much vaccine hesitancy out there. You know, many parents are just taking the wait and see approach to see how other young kids are doing it. Can you give us any context on just how many young people have gotten the vaccine at this point to show parents that there are hundreds, thousands of kids that have already gotten this shot?
So for this particular vaccine, well, I can say that the total number of kids that were included in the evaluation that was submitted to the FDA, that formed the basis of the extension of the EUA, that was in slightly more, it was in about 2,200 kids, so thousands of kids, half of which got vaccine and half of which got placebo. And typically, what these studies would look for would be, number one, would be efficacy. How many kids who got vaccinated got COVID-19 compared to those who didn't? What was astounding was that in the 12 to 15-year-old age group, not a single vaccinated child got COVID-19 during the time period of the study, compared to 18 in the placebo group. So it's absolutely clear that the vaccine works well for 12 to 15-year-olds. And when we look at the reported side effects that we're seeing, they were very, very close to what were reported for individuals 16 and above. So every indication that we have tells us that this vaccine behaves in 12 to 15-year-olds in exactly the same way that it does for those who are over 16.
Okay. And I had one other question that I was going to ask you related to more vaccine hesitancy, but I cannot think of it. So if it comes back to me, I'll get there, but I should be all set. Thank you.
Thanks, Dom. Eric from Argus.
Hi, thanks for doing this. So my question is kind of similar to that. We've been hearing from some parents who say that they don't plan to have their kid get vaccinated because kids don't really transmit it. There's not a lot of risk of death. They're really low risk for this virus. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think that's been a challenge for sure. I think that when I hear that, I do acknowledge that, parents are correct in the sense that children thus far, otherwise healthy children, have been at low risk for having severe COVID-19. However, the other aspect that I think has that for me has been generating more sort of concern is that one of the things that we have been noticing is that it doesn't appear that the teenagers are any less at risk for when they do get COVID to potentially have what's commonly known as long haul COVID or prolonged symptoms. And even if that is not the same as having a child critically ill in the hospital, I think in terms of quality of life and long-term effects, we are seeing that this is happening with our children. And so I think that from that standpoint, that's one point that I think it's important to point out. The other aspect is that while younger children are less likely to transmit COVID-19, I do think that as the pandemic has gone on, it's become more and more clear that older kids, so the teenagers, they do tend to be able to transmit it, almost as well as adults, if not, exactly the same. And where that comes important is that not only do we need everybody to get vaccinated in order to slow the pandemic down as much as possible. I think the other aspect of it that I think is important to consider is, for these kids, think about all the things that they weren't able to do this last year, all the things that really were taken away from them because there was no way to feel protected, from the ongoing pandemic. For the first time, the teens now have a way that they can actually do something active to take their lives back. And I think that, we shouldn't underestimate how much good it will do for kids to get vaccinated simply to be able to help us return to life as we knew it pre-pandemic. The prolonged school closure, decreased access to to sports and activities. These are all things that I would argue also pose a risk to kids and carry with them a risk of long-term harm. And so I think we need to weigh all of those factors into these decisions when families are deciding whether to get their kids vaccinated or not. And I certainly would hope that everybody would see not only does it help protect the kids from the potential effects of COVID-19, but it just helps them get back to life as they knew it. And I think that's something that all of us would agree we want to get back to as soon as possible.
So, just talking about the variants, do we know what those variants do with children? Like, because we know that a lot of the studies looking at what COVID does with kids and transmission and how much it impacts them, it seems like those were like pre-variants. Do we know what the Brazilian or the UK or the California variant, what those look like in kids?
So I don't know if we have data specifically in children, but so far, all the data that we do have regarding protection from the vaccines have been very encouraging. It does look like all of the current vaccines that we have available for use in the United States do protect against most of these variants. And so I don't see any reason why kids would be an exception to that rule. If we know that in adults the vaccines are protecting against variants, then certainly I would expect the same to be occurring in the kids as well.
So I guess in a different way to frame that, so for the variants, do we know if they're also more transmissible in kids? Like this notion that kids aren't as at risk at COVID, is that still true with these variants?
So I think it is true that for some of these variants of concern, for example, B117, the way that I picture this is that the threshold for susceptibility just across the board shifted down. So everybody is, or I guess the other way to put it is, it does appear to be slightly more infectious in everybody. So kids haven't necessarily been spared from that standpoint, but it doesn't mean that kids suddenly are just as susceptible or can transmit just as easily as the adults do. It's just everybody sort of moved up a notch together, if that makes sense.
Okay, I'm all set. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Devin, Local 22.
There we go. Yes, hi, Dr. Lee. Thank you for being here. Some of my questions have already been asked. People are asking really good questions today, but this one's kind of similar to one that came up earlier. I'm imagining, a difficult scenario where a kid who's 12 to 15 wants to get vaccinated. All their friends are getting vaccinated. As you mentioned, they've been through this tough year, but their parents don't want to sign off on it for whatever reason. If it's a case of they're falling for some sort of misinformation or something like that, it's a tough position for a 14-year-old kid to try to convince their parents, this is the right thing for me, this is what I want to do. What would be your advice to those kids? And then what is the role of health experts in trying to make sure these parents are well informed about this and know that, it's the decision in most cases, that needs to be made for their kid and for the general public?
Boy, that's a challenging scenario that you raise. I think it's important to remember that as with any health intervention, I don't think we should view it as just a one-time discussion. And I think the best thing that can be done is just making sure that that families and providers have a trusting relationship that fosters ongoing discussion and communication, and that nothing is done that would erode that trust. And so, I think that the best advice I could give is to say let's not give up when folks do raise questions or are initially hesitant to get vaccines. I think the only way that we can move forward is just by open and honest discussion, and that might not necessarily happen in a single clinic visit. And hopefully, through that relationship and through discussion, we can hopefully convince all families that these vaccines are in fact safe and effective, and certainly we believe they should be given to all eligible children.
And then one of the things we're still sort of waiting on, I guess, is just guidance for the states on how these vaccines should be administered. And I saw that some states, there's different sort of protocol on who can give a vaccine to an adolescent, things like that. What is sort of the process for that in Vermont, and what are you anticipating might be different than the traditional guidance for when you're getting the COVID-19 vaccine for an adult versus what sort of might have to be followed here for the 12 to 15 age range?
So I would say I probably am not a definitive source on this topic. Somebody from the health department probably would be able to give you a more definitive answer. But my understanding is that for 12 to 15-year-olds, the process probably won't be that different compared to for older adults. All of the typical locations in which individuals 16 and older could sign up to get vaccines, I believe should be available to 12 to 15-year-olds as well. As of now, I'm not aware that there are any additional or different recommendations or changes regarding any aspect of the administration itself. It may start to become a slightly different scenario when we do start to get into vaccinating those younger than the adolescent age group. But my current understanding is that the process should be very similar for the 12 to 15-year-olds.
Thank you. That's all I had.
All right, Tim at Vermont Business. Tim, are you there?
Hi, Dr. Lee. Are there trials going on for the other vaccines right now for the younger age groups?
Yes, there are. So Moderna and Johnson & Johnson are also and have been conducting pediatric trials as well. It just happened that Pfizer was able to make it to the finish line first as far as the 12 to 15-year-olds.
I was wondering because there's been a lot of questions about hesitancy. And with other vaccines, maybe polio being the most noticeable, the easier it is to administer and distribute, the easier it is on everybody, it seems, including the parents, which would be very important as we get into the younger age bands. And the Johnson & Johnson is a one shot. Have you been thinking about that as far as, making it as easy as possible and on the families?
Yes, and certainly that is an important issue. Especially for the youngest children, probably the place that would be easiest and provide the greatest sort of comfort level would be the medical home. Now that's just because of some of the challenges with storage and distributing the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, making that transition from doing sort of central and more mass vaccination sites out to providers' offices, not just in Vermont, but across the country, has been a challenging one. I would say that eventually we may get to a stage where that does become an option, and hopefully it may be that Johnson & Johnson vaccine may become an option in the future. However, I certainly would encourage folks not to wait. There should be ample opportunities, despite the challenges, there should be ample opportunities for adolescents to get vaccinated throughout the state once the sites open up. One of the benefits that we have in Vermont in terms of already having been relatively successful in terms of the vaccine rollout is that there are a lot of places that have supply and now know how to do this well. And so I think we're very well poised in the state for kids to be getting vaccines as soon as they're eligible. So while it's an important consideration, I really would encourage folks not to wait and to do everything they can to get those vaccines in as soon as they can.
Speaking of the future quickly, do you anticipate this being sort of an annual flu kind of shot for people, or is it going to be sort of more of a one-time like we're used to with like MMR and other vaccines?
Yeah, I think that it's still a little bit too early to say. Anything that we could say right now would really just be speculation. Given what we know about other respiratory viruses, I wouldn't be surprised if we would end up needing boosters at some point, but how frequent that would need to be, like will it need to be a yearly vaccine like for influenza, or could they be spaced out more? That remains an open question. And, we just haven't, despite the fact that it seems like this pandemic has been going on for forever and a day, we've only known about the virus for not even a year and a half, about a year and a half now. And so, time will tell. And that's why it's going to be important to continue to be very vigilant in terms of good public health and good science to answer that question. If we do start to see any shifts in the patterns of COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Tim. Pat Bradley, you're up.
Good afternoon, Dr. Lee. One of my questions is a quick follow-up to what Timothy just asked. You noted that the Moderna and Johnson & Johnson are currently in trials. Do you have a sense of when they will be approved to come online for the youth vaccinations yet?
Well, Moderna has recently released data from their adolescent trial, 12 to 18-year-olds, that showed very similar findings to Pfizer and very similar findings to what they had found in their adult cohorts. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Moderna applies for an extension for their EUA in that age group fairly soon. I'm not sure for Johnson & Johnson just yet, and what the timeline would be for the younger age cohorts for those companies as well. As I mentioned, Pfizer, it sounds like they anticipate those data being ready by the summer. And beyond that, we'll just have to wait and see. I will say that the pace of everything having to do with COVID-19 vaccines has far exceeded my expectations. And so I just, again, I think it's important just to reiterate what an accomplishment it is that we actually are having the discussion now that we're having, how much sooner can we get the younger kids vaccinated? When the entire, when the best minds in the scientific community around the world all pull in the same direction, it's really amazing what can be accomplished. And so one of the things that I always keep having to remind myself is just what an accomplishment it is that we actually have this tool now available as quickly as we were able to get it.
Dr. Lee, the other thing that I'd like to follow up on is obviously all of this vaccine hesitancy and moving, trying to get people to move past that. As you are interacting with parents and the kids, are you actually seeing a lot of hesitancy? You mentioned that the doctors are really excited about this that you interact with, but what about the patients you yourself are interacting with? What are they saying directly to you?
So for me, I wonder if I, because folks know that I'm an infectious disease specialist, sometimes I wonder maybe I get a slightly skewed response when I talk to folks. I definitely hear, even if not directly in my direct interactions, I definitely know that there are a lot of parents who are hesitant and have concerns. And I think it's just so important and crucial to really do everything we can to get the message out that the vaccines are safe and they are effective. I think one observation I've made is, when I look at all of the physician parents that I know, it's amazing. It's pretty much unanimous. All parents who are physicians who have children who are now eligible are absolutely thrilled that their kids are eligible. And, I think hopefully that should be, that in itself, hopefully can be a powerful message.
How much of the hesitancy is because it's COVID, and how much of it is because it's another injection? Because even before the pandemic, there were parents that didn't like having, the vaccines given to their kids. So is there a meshing of that going on too?
I think that there, may be some element of both. I do think that a lot of the hesitancy right now may be more specific to COVID-19. And part of the challenge has been, and one of the topics that's been discussed extensively, in the public arena has been, concerns that people have raised that the vaccines were developed too quickly, or that there were shortcuts in the process. And to me, that's very unfortunate. It is true that these vaccines were made in record time, but coming from the perspective of myself, I also have a research career, and I am a vaccine researcher. Just because these were developed in record time, that does not mean that shortcuts were taken. When I look at the safety data, when I look at the efficacy data, the trials were done very well and with very strong, very robust results. And I don't. It's almost we almost did too good of a job getting these vaccines out, because now that there's this question and there's this concern. But again, I just, from the perspective of a physician, a pediatrician, an infectious diseases specialist, and a vaccine expert, I would just want to reassure folks that there were no shortcuts taken. The safety data are sound. The efficacy data are strong. These were absolutely very rigorous, very well designed, very well executed trials, and we can trust the data.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Thanks, Neil.
All right, Pat, thank you. And Katie, you are up.
Good afternoon. I wondered what you think is the what you see as the biggest factors that will determine whether there's widespread uptake of these vaccines among kids.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, like what are the biggest factors in your mind that will determine whether there's widespread uptake among kids? Is it about how it's distributed? Is it about how it's communicated, or sort of, yeah?
Yeah, so I think that probably the biggest challenge is, the one that we've been discussing, the topic of hesitancy and willingness to get kids vaccinated. So challenges with distribution, they're real, but those are surmountable. I think the experience that we've had here in Vermont has demonstrated, we can get vaccines into arms here. So that I don't foresee that as being the biggest barrier. I think the biggest barrier is overcoming hesitancy and getting the message out that these are safe, these are effective, and these really are the way to getting all of our lives back. And I don't know if we should underestimate the potential appeal of being able to let our kids sort of go back to their childhood and grow up the way we want them to, without the shadow of everything that's been happening. And really, the quickest and safest and best way to get there is for everybody to get vaccinated as soon as possible.
Thanks. And I also just wondered, when you have conversations with families or with parents and kids in the doctor's office, how are those conversations different from the conversations around hesitancy that you may have with adults? And just very practically, what are the ways you may talk about it differently or address things differently?
Well, so as a pediatrician, when you say have these conversations with adults, are you referring to adult patients, vaccine hesitant adults, or parents?
Yeah, specifically adults, and I understand that may not be you as much, but yeah.
Well, I think that obviously the biggest difference is that certainly individuals generally will have a slightly different perspective when it comes to their children. Things that one of my mentors when I was in training had an expression she was very fond of. Saying that you'll never find a more motivated partner in healthcare than a concerned parent. And I think for me, one of the big differences is really framing the discussion in a way of saying, how can we assure the happiest, healthiest life for your child? Because I think families do think of that through a slightly different prism and lens than they do for themselves. So I don't know if that really answers your question or not, but that's the type of framework that I think that's the reason why the framework sometimes ends up being slightly different.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Marjorie Meyer was able to join us, so I would like to offer an opportunity for anyone who has questions about vaccination and pregnancy, a chance to raise those now. So is there anyone with questions for Dr. Meyer?
Sorry, late. We had like a day. That's
it happens.
It's a day.
So, Doctor, this is Tim McQuiston from Up Business Magazine. What are the concerns, or if any, is the obvious question, I guess.
From the very start, the main concern, well, if you can call it a concern, related to pregnancy was the fact that pregnant women were excluded from those trials, which is very common for many, many trials of many different types. And so the only concern ever was not based in fact, but rather just rooted in the fact that we just had no data. And that really was the pervasive issue that from the start of the recommendations. But what's really changed over time is that as they vaccinated women and as we understood what the risk benefit of vaccine was, and they opened up vaccines to offer it to pregnant women, of course, many accepted it. And it started actually with healthcare workers. And as you know, the CDC has a very robust tracking system for outcomes. And so they tracked those pregnant women quite carefully. And that was the basis of the publication that just came out in the New England Journal, although they had released those data, I think, back in March. Looking at the cohort of women, about 30,000 pregnant women have gotten the vaccine, and they longitudinally been following just under 2,000. And that was by the end of February. So now we have a ton more data. We just haven't seen it. But that was what was in that paper. and basically compared the outcome data to historical controls. And again, we felt comfortable with these kinds of this approach because there was not a solid theoretical tenet by which the vaccine would cause harm, but we had very, very well documented harms about COVID in non-pregnant and especially in pregnancy. And we knew that if you had COVID when you were pregnant, your pregnancies were at much higher risk for adverse outcome. So we already knew that risk benefit. And the risk associated with the vaccine was largely theoretical. And now what we have from that most recent paper was that when you look at historical pregnancy outcome data, it looks very consistent with all of the background outcome data that you get across the country. And that just really solidifies that we know that the benefits of the vaccine have been very, very well established. The risk of getting COVID in pregnancy has been very, very well established. And now, even though women were not in these randomized trials, which is the gold standard, we have very good cohort data that suggests the outcomes, certainly that we only obviously have short-term outcomes, are similar to our background rates. And so all of that together is what sort of frames the current, still stopping short of a recommendation from the CDC to get it, because it still needs to be sort of this individual discussion, because we're not going to have long-term data for a couple of years till we follow those kids out. That's Dr. Lee's job. But it's very reassuring. And so that's why we still feel very strongly that we should offer it to women, and each woman should have a conversation about what her risk of COVID is in terms of her, not just her health, but her pregnancy self, versus the benefit of the vaccine, which is it's very effective, versus the risk of the vaccine, which remains highly theoretical and not, there's not a lot of data that would suggest that there is a risk in the short term. I know that was a long-winded answer, but that's pretty much the sum of where we're at.
All right, great, thank you.
Dr. Dr. Meyer, this is Pat Bradley with WAMC. The data right now, you may be very optimistic about it, and obviously science is changing all the time. But I think a lot of, mothers and pregnant women will look back at past vaccines. I'm thinking, what was it, thalidomide or whatever? I mean, that goes way back. That's why I say the science has changed and stuff. And that was an immediate effect, but there's been other things that don't show up for years after the child has been born, that they then track back to something, an inoculation that the mother had taken. And really just for adults in the 40s and 50s, they thought smoking was fine, no problem. So how can we be so optimistic that inoculating a pregnant mother, this is my cynicism creeping through, is really safe in the long term right now?
And, I totally understand that perspective. And I think that that's really sort of what drives a lot of this. And there are a couple of reasons that I think that it might be a little different. One has to do with teratogens, which really only happen early in pregnancy. And while we don't have a lot of reason to think that the vaccine itself travels very far in your body to get to the baby, we often tell women, look, in the first trimester, there's actually a very high risk of stillbirth just in the general population. And women, as you suggested, have a tendency to think if something bad happened, they go to the one thing they can control because it is too difficult to really put together the things that you can't control. And so we're like, oh, for goodness sake, just don't get it in the first trimester, not because we really think it's dangerous, but just don't bother. And that was the issue with the thalidomide, which was truly a teratogen, which was related to nausea and vomiting in pregnancy, so it was given very early. So that's kind of how those medications work. The second piece of information that's reassuring is, remember what vaccines do is that all they do is introduce to the body the recognition that there's a foreign substance, you need to know that it's foreign, you need to develop an antibody to it and to get rid of it. And as it turns out, sometimes we can trick the body instead of having a virus itself into just having a little piece that can protect you. That's the underpinning of vaccine. And Dr. Lee, I'm sure, can give you like a 5-hour lecture on that, but it's what maternal fetal medicine people do. No, but pretty much. So, so if you get COVID, you develop exactly the same kind of antibody response. Well, not exactly. Okay, that was imprecise. You develop an antibody response that's very, very similar to what the vaccine does. So it's not. So we have a lot of data about what the generation of being exposed to this particular protein, that's the spike protein thing, and what that does to your body during pregnancy, because pregnant women got COVID. So we already know that the actual just development of the antibody, we know a lot about that because pregnant women got COVID. And while if they were critically ill, that impacted their pregnancy, but just the antibody part doesn't really impact it. And I just want to push back that while there are some things, there are medicines that sometimes we learn later on. That's been, you know, people look at thalidomide and DES is another one. But those were early pregnancy things. Most of the other medications that have come along during pregnancy, really, as you give them later, there are not very many of them that actually have an adverse effect. And I want to remind people that we actually now give women the pertussis vaccine during pregnancy, very specifically to boost their antibody level to reduce the chance of neonatal pertussis, of the baby getting pertussis in the neonatal period. And that has been very, very effective. It's reduced that rate by about half. So the idea that we create antibody responses in vaccines in pregnancy, especially not live vaccines, and we can talk a lot about those, but really, even those, they're more theoretical. Babies still actually don't get infected from live vaccines. We just don't give them because it seems like a bad idea. So there's no vaccine that's been demonstrated to be a big problem in pregnancy. We just don't give some of them, but some of them we actually do. We do the flu vaccine, we do Tdap, and we do it for all the similar reasons. Does that answer your question? You can still be skeptical, but.
Yeah, no, I'm not really skeptical. I think I'm just showing my age compared to some of the other reporters.
You and I, we lived through thalidomide and DES.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Meyer.
Can I add on to that a little
Sure.
bit? I think an important point, and this goes to vaccine hesitancy across the spectrum for, you know, when it comes to talking about children, pregnant women, or adults, is, you know, a lot of the reasons that are put forth for why individuals might be vaccine hesitant have to do with potential risks or potential side effects from the vaccines. I think a point that's crucial to make is that there are no risks from any of the currently available vaccines that aren't dwarfed by the risks for those similar outcomes from getting COVID. So the decision about, you know, risks or potential side effects from the vaccine, I think there is a tendency to make that decision in a vacuum, you know, independent of what might happen if somebody actually got COVID instead. And certainly, as Dr. Meyer pointed out at the beginning, we know that pregnancy or COVID during pregnancy, we know that increases risk both to the mother and to the fetus. There's no indication of increased risk from vaccines. When somebody gets COVID, a lot of other things, including a lot of bad things, happen beyond just the specific antibody that the vaccines induce. And I think that, again, I think that's a crucial point, because I fear that a lot of people may be hesitant to get vaccinated for fear of a specific side effect without recognizing that their risk for that exact condition or problem or what have you is infinitely higher due to COVID itself. And I think this discussion sort of illustrates that that dynamic being played out.
Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Great. Any other questions for either doctor? We'll have to wrap up in a few minutes here.
I had a question for Dr. Meyer.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Kristen.
I think that a lot of the concern, a lot of the hesitancy comes about whether or not the vaccine affects fertility. I don't know if this is something that maybe you could comment on. Is there any scientific knowledge or proof that the vaccine affects a woman's fertility?
That got started on social media and was never a part of the science around the COVID vaccine. So again, not only is there not a stringent biological plausibility, even though I know that somebody on social media put one together, it's not that straightforward. And there is absolutely no evidence of that. And in fact, if that were true, we probably would see, whether we'd see a signal of infertility in women that actually had COVID. Again, making this distinction that somehow the vaccine would create some problem that the actually getting COVID wouldn't, that's not very easy to put together. And so we don't have any data that women who get COVID would be infertile aside from their illness, right? Anybody who gets very ill might have fertility problems. But there is no biologic basis and no data that would support that. And clearly, because we talk so much about pregnancy, we know women are getting pregnant before, during, and after their vaccine administrations. So yeah, that started well out of the medical community, and there's not any biologic basis for that.
Okay. And if a woman is carrying their child and they receive the COVID vaccine, that means that their baby could have some immunization to the virus. Is that true?
Many antibodies cross the placenta, especially in the third trimester. And that was actually the basis on which we did the whooping cough boosters later in pregnancy. So yes, if you get the vaccine, especially around in the mid-trimester, around 20 weeks or so, you will develop those antibodies, and then you'll have a good amount of those antibodies that will cross over. I do want to be really clear, though, is that we don't have outcome data that say it would, in fact, protect the baby, although we do know that that happens for other diseases. So there's a very strong biologic plausibility around that, but I just like to be careful about acknowledging that we don't have that as an outcome data point. But the biologic plausibility is very, very strong.
Okay. And does it matter? It doesn't matter if a woman gets the vaccine and they're 5 months pregnant, 9 months pregnant. Is that immunity stronger at certain points in their pregnancy?
It does matter. And this is why, sort of, as you get out of that first trimester, I think it's reasonable to get it relatively soon, because over the course of your pregnancy, most of those protective immunoglobulins cross over in the third trimester, which means the mom has had to make them before then. So it's nice if the mom's immune system is there already making the antibody, recognizing it. And so in the third trimester, as the placenta develops and you're going to have transfer, that it just transfers slowly, daily, in its own way across the placenta and through the third trimester.
So
If you get too late, you won't have a robust enough antibody response. And that's why we get the whooping cough at around 28 to 29 weeks. And that's a booster. So since it's a new response, I always shoot for 20 weeks. The uterus is pretty quiet then. Most women are feeling pretty well. And if you're not, it's just a nice, quiescent time in pregnancy. You've kind of gotten all your ultrasounds done. It's a nice time to do it.
Can infants receive immunity through breast milk if a mother has been vaccinated as well?
If you have immunoglobulins, Dr. Lee is like the super expert on this, so I'll defer to him, but I will tell you it pales in comparison to what they get across the placenta. Sorry, Ben, the placenta wins. But you can comment. Ben is the breast milk immunoglobulin king.
Well, So it certainly, what Dr. Meyer is saying is certainly true. I mean, so all infants do get antibodies from the breast milk. Those antibodies, though, they only protect against things that typically come in through the mucosa or through the gut. So antibodies that a baby drinks in through the mother's milk doesn't get into the bloodstream or doesn't get into the rest of the body. We know that those antibodies through breast milk can be very helpful at preventing certain respiratory infections and very much so certain gastrointestinal infections. But nature's sort of tried and true strategy is to, the term that I use is, the mother is trying to tank the baby up with as much of her good, blood antibodies as possible during that third trimester. And that's very well established in terms of how babies are protected from infections and during the first few months of life. And so I have no reason to doubt that the same thing wouldn't be happening with COVID antibodies as well. If I may, can I also add one more comment? Sorry, I can't resist it, because the question came up about hesitancy regarding questions about fertility. Very recently, there's also been going around people raising questions about COVID-19 vaccines in terms of male fertility as well. And I think this is also, probably started on social media based on, there were some reports based on very small numbers that men with COVID might have some type of, transient impact on sperm counts. And so the question was, well, could that be happening with the vaccines as well? To my knowledge, that there have been at least one small study that showed after you get the vaccine, nothing happens to your sperm count. Something might happen to your sperm count if you get COVID-19. So again, this is another perfect example of the point I was raising earlier. People may be hesitant to get the vaccine because of side effects that they've heard about without realizing that it'd be much worse if you actually got COVID-19. And so, I think it's important. It's just important for folks to have sort of, the full spectrum of information and data to counter some of those misleading claims that are so easy to find, unfortunately.
Okay,
Being very ill is not very good for you.
That raises the last question that I had. That was basically, you're saying there's no proof that it affects fertility. However, if you get it, then, if you get sick, it could start affecting your fertility. So were there ever any times that COVID attacked or infected someone's uterus or someone's reproductive organs? Is there a chance that could happen if they don't get vaccinated and they get COVID-19? That was just some stuff that was circling around social media that I was advised to ask you in this conversation.
I'm not aware of it ever being a target, but Ben, you might know more than I.
No, I think it's sort of, similar along the same theme. I mean, there was the, completely discredited concern that, antibodies that get made to COVID might cross-react and attack the placenta. That's just simply not true. There was a specific protein called syncytin-1 that was highlighted because folks had said, well, there might be some similarities in the actual protein sequences between COVID-19 spike antibody and this protein, but the similarities are in fact minuscule. So that's again another sort of rumor that got unfortunately amplified on social media. I do think I want to be careful, and I don't think Dr. Meyer and I certainly am not saying that if you get COVID-19 that would put your fertility at risk. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that there are many, the likelihood of any type of bad outcome is much worse when somebody actually gets COVID compared to getting a vaccine.
Thank you.
All right. I think we probably need to wrap it up. I know both doctors probably have work to get back to. So if you have additional questions, feel free to send them to me and I will try to get answers from either of the doctors for you. And thank you very much to Dr. Lee and Dr. Meyer for joining us. And thank you all for being here. Take care.